This is Justice Worriers, a podcast where we think about things that are right and wrong in our world and how Christian ideas can help us respond to them. We prefer hard questions over easy answers, and we'd love you to join us in our ramblings. Listen in and contact us using the links in the show notes. Hi listener, welcome back to our conversation with Bethany about Palestine and Israel. We've discussed quite a bit of the older history and context in the previous episode, part 1. This is part 2, episode 63, and we'll just pick up and talk about some of the more modern history, the current situation, and our response.
And one of the things that you mentioned in your paper was that some Palestinian people see a continuity of empires oppressing them over a long period, right, from Ottomans or even before. Mm-hmm. And then the British just taking their place, and then Israel just taking their place. Is that have I represented that?
Yeah, I think that was a quote from a Palestinian woman who referred back to the various waves of occupiers, so from the Ottomans to the British to the Israelis, so kind of this continual movement of being occupied by one group to the next. And in that sense, the kind of ongoing nature of this situation. And for me, it made me reflect on how disconnected we are from our histories, and that we think we can turn up in whatever part of the world and not be seen as a kind of representative of those histories, and that our good works, our good deeds, our volunteering, our humanitarianism, that kind of covers over that history. I think that was my assumption when I started, that I was going to help, so I'm fine. Why would anyone see it anything other than that?
I think that speaks a lot to our individualistic culture, doesn't it? We don't necessarily go somewhere as a representative of any kind of group, do we? We kind of go, well, I have decided that I am going to do this because I'm motivated by this, that, or the other, and we expect when we pitch up in somewhere that probably is often, a lot of the countries that we may well end up in developing world, all over, often do have more of a communitarian sort of view of the world, and don't have that idea that, well, you can just separate yourself from place and nation and be that individual. And maybe we kid ourselves. Well, we do. We kid ourselves that we're.
Well, even beyond that, I think, like, if you think of history more as an ingraining of particular kind of streams, right? Then certain things are more likely than others. So why would a British volunteer end up in Uganda or Zambia much more likely than Argentina? Yeah. Because of these colonial histories that have been there. So the fact that we even know about certain places, that we think about them, that we might go there, always has this much, much deeper history. Or the fact, that we have the resources to do that we have the thought to do that. That's part of a culture around telling other parts or wanting to help other parts of the world. I mean, like, colonialism on its humanitarian side and its motivational side, I always understand as being motivated by wanting to help. And this is the thing I try to teach my students, is that's where it begins, not with some people who just want to divide up the world and catch the spoil. But you don't get popular movements for colonizing unless you sell people this idea that things over there are so dire that they need our input and our help. And I mean, really begins by digging down where you stand, doesn't it? Like saying, well, why do I even know about these places? Why am I even thinking about them in the first place?
It's then not such a big coincidence. I was struck, you were asking about how I reacted, I was struck by this big coincidence that I was there 100 years later.
Yeah.
Well, in that sense,
it's not
there is not so much of a coincidence that I end up somewhere where my great-grandfather had been in the name of the military. I was there in the name of humanitarianism or peace, you could say, but it's only because of those trajectories and kind of imperial histories that
And that's what our individualism, as you rightly say, also drowns out, that we're just grains of sand sliding down the same furrow down the hill in some ways and just making it deeper.
I think the connection of it, like empires, helped me understand. Like my first thought about when I read in your thing about people saying, will you apologise for this thing that happened in 1917, was just like, so many things have happened since 1917. You know, what's the chain of causality? Why is this still so relevant to you now? But if you see it as a continuous history of being ruled by oppressive rulers, then the connection is really straightforward, right? It's only from a kind of individualistic view of like how many people have sort of lived and died since 1917. It can't be that much. There must have been so many things that happened.
There's a Palestinian historian that refers to it in the sense that there's been a 100-year war against the Palestinians. So that's one frame. That's one framing of it. That it's various oppressors, various colonizers. If we're seeing this in a kind of settler colonialism frame, who are, but ultimately that's from the standpoint of the Palestinians. They're experiencing it as a war against them and their land and their livelihoods. And
I think I'm right to say that your work is trying to understand the viewpoint as opposed to saying it's the only viewpoint there is. Is that fair?
Yeah. So I draw a lot from feminist methodologies who would, as I say, kind of privilege the knowledge that comes from the viewpoint of those who are most marginalised in society, or in the world. So wherever, whatever kind of situation of oppression you are looking at, to look at that situation from the experience of the one who is being marginalised, the one who is being oppressed. What is it that their embodied knowledge, their viewpoint on the world, their experience is teaching the rest of us, and that that knowledge is somehow offers a more accurate view of events because of that particular standpoint, and that kind of influenced me a lot as I was thinking through how can I be me as a British researcher, and also try and understand where were these kind of Balfour conversations coming from? What was the what was the understanding?
I'm really quite interested in linking that to the conversation we just had about collectivity and guilt, because I mean the question is what comes out of all of this, right? So in some ways, awareness building is the first step to anything, to understand, well, I'm here because of these kind of deeper grains of history. But then what? Right? I mean, that's always the hard bit, is that, okay, we then realize, and I struggle with that in a similar way when I do work in Africa, that I realize, okay, these structures of privilege have us entangled in ways that allow me to travel and talk about that, but our agency, the more you understand what's going on, the more limited it feels. And then you're like, okay, what can I do with that knowledge now? What falls out from that? What, obviously you tell the story. You need to tell the story, and if I hear you right, a lot of your research is about that, exactly, making the forgotten things visible. But it doesn't seem to change that tragic entanglement, right? That you are in a position of privilege to be able to tell that story to audiences who would otherwise not see it, not even hear it, not even know it's there. And so, we try and think about these systems, but we seem to be unable to change them. Or am I being too negative there? How does that play out in your research? I mean, because that kind of ethical dilemma is something I always wrestle with. Is that I get to tell your story to a larger audience, which is good for my career, by the way.
Of course, yeah.
But nothing really changes for you, right? So it's like that continued nature of this entanglement that just continues in a different form, no matter how good you want to be within it. I don't know. I mean, am I making sense?
Of course, yeah, I think entirely. And I don't know if I don't know if there is an easy answer. Well, of course, there's not an easy answer to that, in the sense that
Any answer will do.
In the sense that it's very hard to, and I think it is impossible to detach ourselves from these systems and these structures. And we think we're living in this country, and we can call out the Britain's history of complicity, but we can also call out the contemporary situation where Britain is still selling arms to Israel, for example, and talk about contemporary complicity. And just knowing about the way that we're kind of enmeshed in these structures is a start, but it's not. But it's not the answer. But I think to think back to kind of individualism and collectivity, I struggle with this, but I think it's really. I think the only answer is, and it's not really an answer, but the only way forward is to think of this in terms of collective responsibility and collective response, because I think one of the traps I sort of began to fall down when I was having these Balfour conversations and talking with Palestinians and thinking about my great-granddad's diary, I began to think of myself and my own kind of connection with these histories in a way that was just very easy to feel very guilty or very like, oh, aren't I special? I've got this kind of connection with this history. And of course, it's not an individual.
Yeah. As if you now had special historical debt to pay, and therefore your activism.
And that kind of made me extra special, and I had compared to the Norwegian or Swedish or Argentinian volunteers I was with, I was somehow singled out as being this extra guilty partner in this. And so I think that can lead to ego-based guilt, which I don't think is the route to any kind of activism or response to any situation. So somehow it's seeing us as part of this collective that...
centering yourself sounds like the kind of thing that Jörg was talking about earlier, of colonialism being helping, but actually it's all about you, right? It feels like if we're centered on our special guilt, it's about us again.
Well, it centers European agency all the time, and this is the thing that you have with decolonizing frameworks too, and the people who rebel against them say, hang on, you're just telling part of the story.
But how do you take some responsibility without making it about yourself?
I think it's not the... I think it's the finding ways of responding collectively, which is possible, but also sometimes I find a challenge if you're not surrounded by people who are like-minded, wanting to go with you on a march, or not wanting to spend your Saturday, or whatever the action is that you want to take. And we're I'll write letters to my MP and happily sit down and do that, but ultimately I'm doing that on my own. You're aware that so many other people are doing that right now, of course, but it's finding ways of imagining a response that is collective, I think.
Those that died by wearing the badge, they're the chosen ones. Those who died are justified for wearing the badge, they're the chosen ones. They're justified. Those that died, they're the chosen whites.
We've come back to this again and again on this podcast with regard to climate change and war. Where is the Old Testament idea, or the Jewish Bible idea of collective guilt? We've lost that, and we've lost ways of understanding that we must atone for it, not in a way that fixes stuff, but actually, sitting out, being punished for it, right? So I don't want to blow fog all over it and like disable activism, but what worries me about a lot of the conversation right now is that it doesn't think about these broader historical trajectories in all we do and how we think what's right and how tragically entangled these deaths are that we see every day in our screens, right? How much pain there is, and of course it's easy then to accuse one of both sidism or whatever. It's not equally distributed all the time. I get that, but it's entangled. And it's the same cry, it's the same pain. And we just don't seem to be able to have expressive rituals for that. I wonder if you've encountered this in your work. Were there ways in which Jews and Palestinians could atone for how they've managed the land together or failed to do so? Have you seen anything of that nature, or is it always just kind of like, here you go, you repent for what you've done, or you're guilty because of X? I don't know, the way in which we just need to learn from this history that we are not good makers of our own fate.
Yeah. It strikes me that it's interesting to think about, so obviously kind of talking about this history, talking about the need to face it and take responsibility because of it, but I'm wondering where atonement would fit in the current context of what I would call a genocide going on. Do you know what I mean? The kind of, how do you think about the current response informed by the history? And current response, I mean, what should the British government be doing? Because in all of this, I feel like it's very easy to, again, go into an individualizing panic about what can I do, but actually right now, so much of the power is in the hands of the state, I think, and its response. But yeah, what would it almost, to me, atonement is political action right now, and it's stopping supplying arms, and it's making political statements in support of a ceasefire and those kind of responses informed by this history and taking on the responsibility that it should because of that. But
okay, so it's hard to keep Jörg and Leah at bay, but I feel like there's a bit of history I feel like we got to a really critical point in history and then we stopped.
Yeah.
And I don't want to leave it unsaid. So right around, I think in 1948, there's something which the Palestinians refer to as the catastrophe, right? And then I also want to talk about what's happening now in some way. So can we start with, and then can we do a bit more of the philosophizing?
Your daily pain is to keep the two of us.
So what happened in 1948? What is the catastrophe?
Yeah. So as an outcome, and I mean, it happened in 1947 and 1948, but as there's fighting between the Zionists and the Arabs over sovereignty of this piece of land, we're talking about what happens is what's referred to in Arabic as the Nakba, or the catastrophe, where I think it's 750,000 Palestinians are made refugees. Hundreds of Palestinian villages are destroyed. I think it's 15,000 Palestinians were killed, which has been referred to as the Nakba, and is this point in history that Palestinians look back to as the catastrophe, as the disaster. But then obviously we think of the over 50,000 Palestinians who have been killed since October 2023. You know, it kind of is a jolt, isn't it, to think of those numbers. But that was the outcome of those years of fighting between 1947 and 1948, and then in May 1948, there's a declaration that the State of Israel comes into being. And at that point, the West Bank becomes under Jordanian control, and fast forward through a few more wars, you get to 1967, where Israel takes control of the West Bank and Gaza and the Golan Heights. And they become officially occupied territories. And so at that point, there's Israel and then Palestinian occupied territories, which is the kind of situation on the map as we see it today, except for the fact that these occupied territories, the West Bank in particular, is now dotted with illegal, according to international law, Israeli settlements. So small towns, villages, universities, factories that are Israeli settlements in the midst of this occupied land.
And a wall snaking around them in some areas.
A wall, yes. A wall dividing those territories, which doesn't actually fit to the 1947 Green Line. So there was the Armistice Line that was drawn up by the UN in 1947, which divided, for example, the West Bank from the rest of or became Israel, the wall that now divides the West Bank from Israel encroaches on that green line. So there's then land that's caught between the green line and the wall. And then fast forward to 2005, where Hamas are elected in Gaza through a democratic process. In 2006, because Hamas is armed, Israel withdraw its troops from Gaza at that point, blockade it, and blockade it via land and via sea and in control of the airspace still. And Gaza then becomes under Hamas control. And so officially then Israel is still in occupying power over Gaza, because even though it doesn't have, at that point, didn't have troops on the ground, it's still in charge, it's still controlling its borders, so sea, land and air. And so as an occupying power, it would then have responsibility to allow humanitarian aid into the strip.
So that's how you end up with this very different situation. Even before the October attacks, you have this very different situation between what it's like for Palestinians in Gaza and Palestinians on the West Bank.
Yeah.
Neither are good, but so when you went, you were in the West Bank and Jerusalem, and that's where you were doing the accompanying through the checkpoints between all these different kind of.
So at that point, I could get into West Bank or East Jerusalem, but I couldn't get into Gaza as a volunteer or as a tourist.
And it's also the sort of the way that Hamas then rules Gaza and purges political opponents in a very brutal way. What was that, 2007 or so? Like, I mean, there's this taking over of Palestinian Authority and people who are loyal to Abbas, and also sort of murders of people and disappearance and brutal torture. So I mean, Hamas is a very different kind of regime. I mean, yes, they are democratically elected originally, but are they not also quite a bit more brutal to their own people? Also, then in the way they perhaps do weaponize them in the form of human shields, or do not provide cover for their own people.
Yeah, to be honest, I don't know enough about the situation in Gaza. It's not kind of, that bit of the history isn't something I've studied, and then not having been there, I can't really comment on kind of the way it was governed. My understanding of Palestinian politics is that there's disappointment with every Palestinian political party, because often because of the way that it's actually servant to the occupying powers in many ways, and also the violence that breeds violence, I think, in these situations. But I don't feel I can comment too much on it.
Okay, and so then just to bring us up to date, so then in the context of all of these appalling things, there's then a horrific terrorist act by Hamas, slaughtering lots of civilians, capturing hostages, which was something like over a year ago.
2023.
And since then, the Israeli military has been making incursions into Gaza. Gaza has been blockaded at various times from any access of any food or anything getting in, medical supplies, over long periods, not for the whole of that time, but for months at a time, including for something like 4 months up to very recently, and then there's been a trickle of stuff getting in recently. There's also no foreign journalists allowed in Gaza by the Israeli forces. You described it earlier, Bethany, as genocide, and I would agree with that description. From my very limited knowledge of just hearing about all of this on the news, it looks like an intentional starvation and killing by military force of people, and the Israeli leadership. Lots of people very senior in the Israeli leadership have explicitly talked about removing the Palestinian people from their homes in Gaza, and much worse, acknowledging that Hamas leadership and possibly other people have talked about removing Israel from the map as well. But at the moment, it looks to me like a deliberate attempt to exterminate or remove people in the numbers of millions of people. And that's the situation we're in now. I would, by the way, recommend, when we're talking about the settler experience in the West Bank, I'd recommend the Louis Theroux documentary that came out recently, which is called The Settlers. I think it helped me to understand how serious the situation is in the West Bank as well as in Gaza. So putting that out there, my understanding of the situation is that this looks like a genocide. I think the Western governments need to be really careful about the words they use, because my understanding is that if Western leaders use the word genocide, they'd have a legal obligation to intervene, which they don't want to do.
So it was taken to the International Courts of Justice by South Africa to decide whether a genocide was taking place, and one of the findings from that, I think it's, as I understand it, that case is still going through the courts, but I think it was about a year ago the ruling on that was that it's highly likely that a genocide is taking place. And part of that ruling was that in response to that judgment, Israel had an obligation to allow humanitarian aid through, and that was part of the obligations on Israel, kind of in response to this ruling that was highly likely. So, and then organisations like Amnesty, for one, has taken on that language of genocide.
And the UN, I don't remember exactly who it was for the UN, but someone with responsibility for this area described what they saw as genocidal acts, and lots of this language has become been used by people who used to be held up as authorities, but recently the waters have been muddied a lot about whether the UN can be trusted on any of this stuff. But there are people who have reason to do that.
Yeah, and hence now, as I understand it, Israel and the US have this plan to set up their own aid distribution in Gaza, and they're actually starting to.
Well, it's already in effect. I mean, this is where the murders, the massacre happened the other day.
Yeah, I was going to say, as we record, there was a report about a day or two ago of what sounds like a massacre, but there's no information. There's no journalist there.
And the pictures put out in defense were from a different place. So I should say
they
actually show attacks. I mean, it's a misinformation war.
So the accusation is that Palestinian civilians were fired upon by presumably Israeli soldiers, and there just isn't any information at the moment.
And now you do what they tell you. And now you do what they told you.
I mean, at the risk of taking too much of a zoom out again, but I do wonder what sort of allyship building, coming back to your question, Leah, is actually needed in the situation, because it's one thing to call on Western governments to act and to do what? That is not in the same line of colonialism. I agree with you, not delivering weapons would be a first step. But then if you listen to the many podcasts Ezra Klein has done on the issue, you get a good sense of how deep it goes and how deep-seated anxieties and fears are. You listen to Ehud Olmert on the BBC, or you watch Demonstrations for Peace that are also trying to hold their own prime minister account. So, what kind of alliances can we build that expand the usual game of this almost? I'm even appalled by the sort of and you allude to this sort of tactical use of language. And there's something in me that screams, and I know that's not the legal answer. It's like, what does it matter if somebody dies of a genocide? I mean, people are being slaughtered, starved, and rockets are still flying in both directions. And I mean, all this kind of definitional language, what does it take to break us out of this kind of they did that and they did that, and to actually think, okay, don't people on both sides just want to get on with their lives, bake bread, do whatever? And then how can we build alliances that isolate those wolves who feed on conflict, those parasites who just kind of need to keep this going for their own interests. And of course, there's many conversations already being had about whose interests are really at stake here for keeping the war going. So, but I'm not seeing any answers. I mean, this kind of coalition building or back channeling. I mean, liberation theologians did that for some time, right? You had sort of bringing Jews and Palestinians together, and I mean, this was all symbolic and small scale, or kibbutzim, those kind of places did exist. And it's like, that's completely narrowed, that space for those kind of alternative
And ultimately, I think there needs to be a long-term solution for the occupied territories, including Gaza, and any that's got to be held as the ultimate goal of anything right now. And so, I don't know, as someone who's got an interest in this in terms of research and personally as well, I'm finding it very hard to know how to respond, and have done since October, in the sense of feeling mostly powerless, and mostly that it's when you've got what's coming out of the American administration in terms of, and this I don't know, it's not hopeful and to what I can see as possible, but I guess if anything, it feels to me that the push has to be back on top level diplomacy right now, and as citizens we can do our part in terms of making sure government knows how we feel, but it seems a drop in the ocean, doesn't it, in terms of what's going to change actual things on the ground.
I mean, this is why I appreciate Ezra Klein's podcast so much, because he managed to bring people on from both sides. So like in the sort of because I'm thinking about even the situation here, we don't manage to get people together who feel differently on demonstrations that you see in the UK, right? We just don't. We'd rather not talk about it in church. It's a like, how do you even have this conversation, right? And I find myself in personal conversation with people, like, depending who's in front of me, you sometimes push in one way and the other way, right? To kind of moderate this a little bit. When I talk to an evangelical telling me how, I don't know, this is God ordained or something, I'm very much pushing against it. But I feel equally puzzled by some of the sort of more radical left that says, that, well, first of all, it also veers very close or into a territory I would call anti-Semitism, doesn't produce new languages, builds bridges, and thinks the solution is simple. And is there not more that we could do beyond thinking about the political solution, which is out of our hands, and create spaces where encounters can happen between groups and proponents of both? And this is not how it seems to be happening. And it's the same with any other conflict, by the way, that I know of. I mean, think about Ethiopia or other places. It's extremely hard to stay neutral, and yet I wonder if that's exactly the thing we need to be pushing for, not neutrality for the sake of pulling out, but to say, well, how can people who are not personally directly involved help build a space where an encounter can happen between people who are?
But I think it does go back to the thing that we started with, which is that if we recognise that all of us at some level or other have some kind of complicity with what's going on, that stops us being able to go, well, you're doing this and you're doing that, and why can't you guys just, be peaceful together? There's something about being able to, I suppose if you use the Christian word, to be incarnational, to recognise that we are part of the situation.
This is why I think those two things connect, right? Because it's one thing to say, well, we have this historical guilt, so therefore we now must do our best to undo it, which still doesn't realize that we're able to then destroy in other ways. But to say this historical guilt should teach us humility and the need to listen to voices I don't agree with, and to hear pain wherever it occurs. And somehow, I don't know, what does it mean to be peace builders? Right? So I agree with you, Beth, on the question of weapons and all those other questions. I just don't know that's, well, it's not the answer, obviously, but I don't know if we need a more universal push toward. This is why the idea of reconciliation came up, or repentance also. It was just realizing how tragic and deep this goes. And if we don't do something radically different than, say, intervene on this side or the other side, it's just going to get worse. And I mean, the sort of chipping away at the two-state solution has long been going on, and you just kind of wonder, other than a change of mind and learning how to live together, what does it even look like?
But it's so far from
I know.
a case of learning to live together.
Yeah.
In the sense that the political organisation of those lands is untenable, and life and I go back to my point about standpoint theory, feminist methodologies. It's in other radical forms of thinking as well. It's not just feminism, but this sense of listening to the most oppressed in that situation. And I guess that would be the lens I would take on this. Who right now is most at risk, who right now is most oppressed, who right now is losing life at an incredible pace. And that includes those members of those hostages who are being kept there, completely part of this situation, and those families in Israel who I don't know how are living through this situation as well. But this, for me, the occupation of Palestinian lands, Gaza, the West Bank, the Golan Heights, the violence that's crept into southern Lebanon is the tragedy that is right before us, kind of right now. And there's all kinds of people who are caught up in that from different backgrounds and religions and situations as it has an impact on Israeli populations as well. But I find it hard to think about peace building right now, I guess, in the sense of bringing people together when that's still the situation after how many decades of this this conflict
I agree entirely. I don't want to sound overly naive. I think some sort of strategic naivety is sometimes helpful, but these things, after these kind of extremely intensive encounters, it's very hard to rebuild. I guess what I was thinking about is also the conversation here. This sort of whataboutism.
Yeah.
The sort of teetering back and forth between different people's pain, and what does it actually look like to put it both on the same screen?
Yeah.
And then to realize complicity with both.
Yeah, and to
types
see it
of
all.
pain.
Yeah.
To see it all.
Within the same frame, even though it's massively
and
different levels at times, and
and not even as a solution that is going to somehow bring peace to an area, but like, why is it so difficult for us even to organize a civil conversation around these things in this country or anywhere, or in Germany, where indeed there's some people will claim there's censorship around what you can and cannot say, and it is, of course, extremely sensitive in my country, and for the right reasons. And this is also a reason why I would very much hesitate to comment on contemporary politics, because I think, but peace building is something else. And how does what does a Christian grassroots movement for peace building look like that doesn't see itself as the answer, as if we get together in church and we say and pray the right things and somehow the world will be healed? I mean, it's again that sort of colonialism.
Yeah.
But don't we still have a role to play in that we pay attention, in that we see clearly, in that we do try and build spaces where we can see both in the same frame, even as a small prophetic contribution to a different way of seeing the world, where it doesn't matter what language you speak, where you're from, that your pain, your grief is the same.
Some of those that work forces.
And maybe there is a way to a better listening through an awareness of these imperial histories and the way that we're complicit in them. In that, there's talk about kind of unlearning our privilege, and that can be a way into, I think, a way of clearing out something of that kind of burden of history, in the sense that Palestinians seeing me in a particular light because of that history. If I'm doing the work, as we say, to kind of unpick and understand that, and I'm not then bringing defensiveness to the table, I'm not bringing anger to the table, I'm not trying to make myself out as an individual and somehow unique and special because I see myself as a humanitarian, that kind of unlearning of privilege, whether it's in the UK or elsewhere, I think that can kind of clear the way for a better listening to the voices of those who are in pain and politically oppressed and physically in danger and feeling fearful of for their safety in all kinds of ways. It's not the only answer, but I think it is perhaps one way towards a better listening. Yeah, I guess that's a big part of eventual peace building or better dialogue or better understanding, and perhaps that's something the UK would definitely benefit from, just even if it's how to react to a big Palestine march on a Saturday, or how do we talk about these things in the...
Yeah. And I mean, one thing I keep thinking about too in the context of British culture, but that's my own, that comes back to something that I find deeply uncomfortable. That's the way war is remembered, especially on Remembrance Day. And I think the colonial history played into this a bit more, but also then again, well, remembering, first of all, there's no such thing as a just war. Maybe for a just cause, but the war itself will always breed injustice. But then also the fact that we haven't learned to remember war in a way that commemorates the dead on both sides. I don't know of a ritual that enables that. There's some of that in Germany because of the complicated history, but that makes war memory difficult in other ways. And obviously we have sort of the political commemoration, the landing of the Normandy and where everybody gets together. But on a civil society level, in Germany, we'd rather not talk about the war. You would never see a remembrance celebration in the church. I mean, other than in the sense of collective guilt and repentance, it's much more difficult to remember the fallen in that context. And then in the UK, it's like our dead, our fallen. And so, it feels like it needs an on-the-ground re-engineering of how we remember pain.
Yeah.
Okay, so Bethany, we've kept you here a long time. I do have two more things I want to do, so we have not finished, but we are on the home stretch. Right, so first of all, I want to put a question to everyone. Please put yourself in the shoes of a listener who's listening, who believes or might believe that God is establishing Israel, and that Israel is special in God's eyes. What do you say to that person, or how does that? Do you want to argue against that viewpoint? Do you want to talk about this situation in the context of that viewpoint? How do you react to that?
My question to that person, and I'd love if somebody does have those views to get in touch, maybe by email, or if they'd be brave enough to come.
We'd like to talk to you.
Yeah, we'd love to talk to you. My question would be, what do you think the Old Testament says about trusting in armies and trusting in the machinery of war? Is it clear cut? And I know there's difference. Is it clear cut that that's the way that God would seek to establish the land of Israel? No. That trust in might and right. And I think you could have an interesting conversation about that, because I think there are bits of the Old Testament where it seems very clear that God says go out and slaughter these people and attack them, but then there are other bits of the Old Testament where it very much says that you're not to rely on might. So I think that would be an interesting conversation to have, and whether there's an Old Testament versus New Testament version of that. I think there'd be
I would see
an
it as
interesting debate.
Like the history versus prophets is the way I see it in that. Listener, how do you respond to the parts of the Bible where God is reported as saying, kill everyone, make sure they're all dead, there's no one left? And how do you respond to the parts of the Bible where God says to Israel, because of the way you treated this foreign nation or the foreigners among you, both of those things are said, God's furious anger about the way the nation of Israel is behaving is there in the prophets, including behaving towards neighbours and people living within their land. My response to that is is like, oh, I can't handle the first bit I mentioned, and the second bit sounds really like what I think. But what is your reaction to those bits?
And then where does that then come into the Jesus story and the things that Jesus said? How do you follow that through? I just think that's a genuinely interesting conversation about, as you say, I know what I think, but I think you can look at it in other ways.
All right, that was that bit.
Yeah.
Okay, so the last bit, because we just had to do that bit, right? The last bit is I'm doing prayers on Sunday at church. I'm leading the church in praying on Sunday. And generally when I'm going to be doing prayers, I look at the news, and I know that the bit of the news that I'm going to be looking at and the bit that's going to be dominant is the appalling suffering of so many people in this situation, especially the civilians and children of Gaza, who are still suffering starvation and military attack and being moved or being ordered to move, and just a complete lack of safety. And for some reason, while we've been having this conversation, 24-year-old me comes to mind, because when 9/11 happened, I was in Prague at a conference, and the conference was interrupted to put the pictures on the screen in the conference centre. The conference was stopped, and I ended up out with a friend of mine who worked in the city in the finance industry, and so who knew people who were working in the Twin Towers when they were destroyed. I think eventually found out that the people he knew had got out, but obviously it was very close to him what happened. We went out and we were drinking. We came back to the hotel we were staying in, and we got into a conversation in the lobby. This is two young, white, stupid men. We got into a conversation in the lobby with two Palestinian men who worked at the hotel, and we said to them, like, why has this happened? And they were like, there's a clear reason why this has happened. It's not come out of nowhere like you think it has. And they tried to say to us, read the history of the situation. This situation that we talked about this evening is what they were talking about as the reason for this. And I remember at the time doing my best to project a kind of friendly naivety of and saying, I remember saying, "Oh, I'll go and read about it," and
you did the British thing.
So I had almost like one of these Balfour conversations that you described, Bethany. But it was so clear to me. I mean, to be with someone, we'd not only been drinking, we'd bought extremely expensive bottles of wine, because this person was like a city trader, had tons of money. And it was so stark. The lack of historical education that I had, the privilege that I was, and all of the illusions I was under, and then I was very briefly confronted with a very different viewpoint that was telling me that I was so naive and so privileged. And anyway, why do I tell that story? Because somehow I want my prayers to somehow engage with
24-year-old
that
Andy.
person. What do I do?
What do you want them to do? What with 24-year-old Andy?
Well, I don't know. I don't want to speak to 24-year-old Andy. I guess I want to. Going back to something we talked about a long time ago on the podcast, I want to be all of the people that I am and have been, and still engage with God and lead people to engage with God about this situation. If you've got any suggestions, I would welcome them.
I mean, what are those prayers doing, right? I mean, not to begin even venturing into this territory, but in the way that we want them to be meaningful, it's quite easy to veer into the territory of the instructional. And I don't think that's helpful at all. And the more I think about conflicts or the way the world has shifted these past 15 years, the more the sort of old Pentecostal talk of powers and principalities and spirits comes to mind. Not in that this present darkness kind of novelist, New Devils kind of idea, but in a way that somehow we get taken hold of things, or in the way that we talked about the sort of erosions of history that we just slide down. And is there a way of acknowledging our powerlessness and yet speaking against those things that keep carrying us, or that pray for deliverance from these powers? Because I don't know that that's going to come, but it's the only cry I know how to say, because I don't trust any of us to bring the right solution into those conflicts. And they need to end, and everything is, all the things that we discussed, they are important to be out there. But the vileness of humanity and how that's been on display, and the way in which fear, hate just flames in us. I mean, that's the only image that comes to mind for me. This is also why I found it difficult to engage with your previous question, because I don't want to imagine the other. Like, I want to hear from them. It's not my viewpoint, but what do I know? And is my hubris not bad? Doesn't it appear the same to them? Or these academics always talking on and sounding so smart and not really knowing anything about my life? So in a way, we just find ourselves in these really, really horrible webs of history, of entanglement, and that's the thing I want to be freed of. And I don't know that that's going to happen or how, but that's the only prayer I got left.
Yeah, we've talked before about understanding the world in terms of words that we might once have used to mean like things outside of ourselves, like evil and the spirit of this or that or the other, and reimagining those things as things that in some sense are from within us or from within us collectively.
Or maybe be silent. I don't know.
Well, you joke, but
no,
I was at a conference a couple of weeks ago, and at the conference were various people, some Israelis, talking about remembering the families of the hostages, other academics talking about Palestine. There was a lot in that in that conference. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of, even just listening, there's a lot kind of evoked. And then at the weekend, this was in Paris, and I walked around the corner and I was along the streets and saw a peace group. I don't know exactly who they were, but they were stood in a circle with black T-shirts on, holding up placards for remembering people in Gaza, just in silence in the midst of a busy street. And probably it was the kind of impact of having had those conversations and then just encountering silence and remembrance in that kind of unexpected place was kind of, just a really moving moment, and kind of somehow brought some of that talk to mean something in me that I don't know what it meant, but it kind of was a powerful moment. And
because all the talk that we do around these things doesn't stop any suffering. Like, it's like, what is it we're actually doing in this? It's important to participate, not look away.
Slightly different. There was a very moving thing I saw recently where some people read the names of the 15,000 children who've been killed in Gaza. That kind of, and the naming of the hostages, the naming of some of the Palestinian victims, that thing of humanity, the people, the individuals.
Having it all in one frame again,
But equally, silence. You've obviously got South Sudan raging as well, and horrible loss of life there too, haven't you?
Yeah, well, I'm thinking about silence. So if you're a church listener, and this podcast probably comes out after that, if you had to sit through some silence, this is probably why. All right. Well, Bethany, thank you so much for sharing some of your story and giving us some information, and especially for grounding all of that in personal experience that doesn't look away from the fact that everyone comes into a situation with a whole load of personal and national history. So thank you. It's been fantastic. Thank you. And we'll see you next time.
Killing in the name of, killing in the name of, killing in the name of.
You've been listening to Justice Warriors. You can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and you can also follow us on social media by searching for Justice Warriors, where warrior is spelt like someone who worries about things. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and leave us a rating, since that helps other people find us. Also, please tell your friends about us in real life. We'd love to hear from you. To get in touch, use the email address in the show notes or contact us via the social media links. Thanks for listening.
And now you do what they told you. And now you do what they told you.